Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Praveen Bommareddy. I am Executive Director, Research and Translational Medicine at Replimune. On behalf of the SITC, I would like to welcome you to our Biotech Virtual Program Series. I would like to thank my co-organizer, Joanna Grossman, Head of Healthcare and Life Sciences Capital Markets of the New York Stock Exchange, as well as our outstanding faculty today, Doctors Rachel Humphrey and Robert Coffin, for sharing their time and expertise. Just to kick things off, I would like each of you to share a bit about your backgrounds and, just give us some thoughts on what drew you to the biotech field. What are there any pivotal moments that really shaped your career paths and trajectories? So if you can give some, information on that, that would be great.
Okay, who do you want to start?
So I'm happy to start. It's
Yeah.
easy to do it. I'll raise my hand. So I'm Rachel Humphrey. I'm the founding CEO of Normunity, which is a startup biotech company developing novel anti-cancer therapies. I've been in the drug industry for over 25 years, which I'll tell you about. My career took me across a range of companies, both large and small, where many different roles I played developing and launching cancer drugs, I think prepared me for becoming the CEO of a biotech. I've worked 16 years in big pharma and 10 years in biotech before I took the role I'm in now. I found that these different sizes of drug companies and different product development paths offered me a range of experiences that collectively built skills for founding a biotech. Biotech companies require you draw from lots of diverse experiences. And I highly recommend, I'll say upfront, that you live through some of these experiences before you jump right in. Although I think there are very brave people who've jumped in early and done quite well. I can tell you, I think that my experiences have really helped make this a lot easier for me than I think it would have been. So, and I'll just say a few more things about that and then turn it over. First, let me say I started in larger pharma companies, earning my stripes in cancer drug development at Bayer, where I led the development of the small molecule kinase inhibitor Nexivar that went on to be a blockbuster. Then I joined BMS, which is where I jumped in with both feet in the early days of immuno-oncology, as lots of people know. At BMS, I shepherded the in-licensing and development of Yervoy, the first immunotherapy to extend life in any cancer, and the drug that arguably started the revolution in immunotherapy, arguably, but still, it was a big deal. I led that program at BMS for 8 years, first advocating hard for the in-licensing, which was not easy, and then guiding the global team through the regulatory approval to a year post-global launch. After working at these large pharmaceutical companies where I learned a lot about process and order and how things get done, I took my expertise to biotech, where I was the chief medical officer of a number of companies, Black Diamond, Cytomix, Mirati. The experiences at biotech gave me access to growing startups, raising money, and pushing into new areas of science. And then between these biotech roles, I also spent a year at AstraZeneca, where I built the immuno-oncology department and helped to bring Imfinzi forward. I think all of those things were very important. And by the time I was ready to build the company from scratch, I'd seen so many core patterns in all the key elements. I think it made it a lot easier. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rachel. That's a great intro and great insights into your career path. And, it's great to see you did a lot of, pioneering forefront in getting the IO up and running from the boots, from the ground. And it's great to hear that you're involved in the launch of Yervoy and also helped AstraZeneca to build up their IO. So it's all great insights. Rob?
Well, I think we can certainly say that IPI was what kicked it all off. So Rachel is being a little bit, underwhelming with what she did. So no, Yervoy absolutely kicked it all off, and none of us would be here doing immuno-oncology if it wasn't for that, because the reality is that we know that anything to do with cancer immunotherapy, cancer vaccines and related stuff had very much been a backwater until then, as was evidence that if you went to the SITC meeting, there were probably 50 people there.
There were 50 people.
After there were thousands. So it really did kick it all off. There's no doubt about that. Anyway, I certainly had a very different background and came very much from academia, where I was originally actually a plant virologist, strangely. I did a PhD in plant virology at Imperial College in London back in the actually late 1980s. Although even then, what I was really thinking about was how to apply that technology to actual human sort of benefit, i.e. developing real products which could be useful to humans. So while it wasn't directly what my PhD was about, the intent was to use plant viruses as means to deliver antigens as vaccines to humans, particularly using tobacco mosaic virus, actually to encode quasi-species of HIV antigens on the surface of TMV, which could then be used as an HIV vaccine. However, that didn't actually end up going anywhere, and I moved to UCL, University College London, to do initially a postdoc in herpes simplex virology, studying herpes simplex virus latency, but also developing vectors based on herpes simplex virus, in particular for gene delivery to the nervous system. Where we were initially trying to develop vectors to treat Parkinson's disease, funded by the Parkinson's Disease Foundation, amongst other neurological diseases, including MPS diseases, chronic pain, and other things. So over time at UCL, I moved to being a lecturer and finally a senior lecturer, having a research group of probably about 30 people. And in 1999, we felt we'd made considerable strides in developing HSV vectors, which could really be translated into the clinic. And based on that IP, I span a company out of my lab with the help of UCL, which was then called Neurovex, to try and take these things forward and actually take them into the clinic with venture capital funding. So that company started in 1999 with initially £3 million of funding. We spent the first couple of years trying to do the things I said, but also in addition, a dendritic cell vaccine for melanoma using HSV to deliver to dendritic cells. And to cut a long story short, a few years in, we decided that neurological gene therapy was tougher than we had hoped it was going to be, and was clearly going to take a long time to ever get to a finish line. And simplistically, maybe cancer was, in inverted commas, easier. From the perspective of killing things is probably easier than fixing things. And what you're trying to do in cancer is kill tumors, whereas in gene therapy, you're trying to fix the intricacies of how cells work. So in any case, we then transitioned largely to the oncolytic virus space, where we felt we could do better than what had gone before, very much climbing on the shoulders of what had gone before, to develop what ultimately became TVEC, which was developed in a number of different settings, but ended up being approved in 2015 by the FDA and elsewhere in the world. After the company had actually been acquired by Amgen in 2011. So I actually then went to move to Amgen for a few years before leaving Amgen, spending a year or so sort of twiddling my thumbs and thinking what next, but in reality thinking about what became Replimune, which was also founded in 2015 by me. So I ran all the R&D at Biovex from the beginning to the end. Initially was a CEO of Replimune through and beyond a NASDAQ IPO. Then as things got a lot more complicated and we were trying to do a lot more things, ran only the R&D. My colleague, Philip Astley-Spark, who was executive chairman, became CEO. And as I say, I was running the R&D through until getting the data, which is now subject of a BLA filing and being reviewed by the FDA for the treatment of anti-PD-1 failed melanoma with a PDUFA date in July. So that's really my history. And unsurprisingly, many things have been learnt along the way, which I'm sure Praveen can try and get out of me.
Great story. Really great story.
Yeah, great story. You know, it's been a long time. I think it's a very long time since both of you started your first biotech. You know, what are those experiences like? Are there any key lessons you have learned from that first launch, and do they still apply today, considering the market, the landscape and everything have changed so much during the last 15 years? So how do you see that, and what are the biggest lessons from the first launch of the biotech?
I can go first. I think one key lesson when you're founding a biotech company is to be clear about your personal goals and what you're there to do. And by personal goals, I mean, obviously business goals. What are you trying to achieve? A clear vision is vital. And I don't think that's different now than it ever was before. They take a lot of time and energy, more than you can imagine. And so you want to be sure that you're in the bullseye of what you want to be doing. My career path from the very beginning, as I described before, was really focused on bringing innovative, first and best-in-class cancer drugs to the clinic and to approvals in companies both large and small. So while I really only built one company, I'm in my fourth year. I built immuno-oncology departments. I've initiated novel organizations from the very beginning. I'm in my 30th year. And I think the goals of all of those overlap substantially. The second lesson, which I think is also very important then as now, is the people on your team. At any company, you want to be surrounded by great people. This is magnified in biotech companies where the key members of your team are absolutely the essential ingredients for your success. My choice all along from the very beginning was to try to bring in as many people who know what they're doing as possible, although there's plenty of room for bright, fabulous folk who have the right approaches to building novel things, but be very careful and thoughtful about who you put on your team. And that's where networking is important, and I'm sure we'll get to that later.
Thank you, Rob.
So I would certainly agree with everything that Rachel just said. The people are absolutely key, but also one as a founder is leading the company and has to have the vision for the company. And I think a key thing is that one needs to, one, have the courage of one's convictions to really do everything you possibly can to take your idea forward. And while one obviously needs to listen to all points of view, one should also not be overly swayed by points of view, which with thorough sort of vetting may not make sense. So to some extent, you often need to appear to be very stubborn, when in reality you're not being stubborn. What you're actually doing is assessing all points of view, including one's own, and taking what you think is the best decision at the time to actually enable the company to go forward. And it's certainly the case at various points in my career. If certain particularly loud voices had been listened to, the company would not have made it to the next stage and got to the finish line. So courage of one's convictions without being, which can appear to be stubbornness, but should not be arrogance. Certainly one's own ideas are not necessarily the best. One should always very much be willing and happy to live and listen to other people's ideas and go with those ideas if indeed those are the best way forward. And that comes back to having good people who are going to have good ideas to help you do that. So I do think those are necessary attributes for a founder and somebody who's actually gets something from the start line to the finish line, because these projects do basically take roughly a decade, usually from beginning to end, to get from idea to actually approved drug and hopefully commercial success. And the other thing is that one has to be all in. One can't do it in a half-hearted way. One has to, as Rachel also said, essentially devote one's life to it and to some extent put other things aside, which isn't necessarily the best for a well-balanced existence. So I'm, quite old now, and I didn't end up having children until I was pretty old as a result, because I'd spent my time basically doing 110% or more, trying to do what we were doing otherwise. So you have to be prepared to do that. And if you're not prepared to do it 100%, don't do it at all.
Courage and humility.
Courage and humility.
Courage and humility.
And Rob, while you're here with me, so I'm going to ask you, I'm curious about your decision to start Replimune privately without licensing any molecules from university. Rachel, how do you view this approach? What are the pros and cons of building something from the ground versus relying on external academic partnerships or in-licensing of molecules where, something is already established, now you have to further develop this?
Rob, why don't we start with your question about bringing it in without
Sure.
licensing?
So I think Biovex was sort of a bit of a hybrid in a way because they did in-license technology, but it was type licensed technology from my academic lab. So the founding IP and the founding materials, as it were, had already been in existence and had been worked on for a decade before that was all transferred into the company, and UCL got equity in return for that. So it was licensed in that way. At Replimune, you're correct. We didn't in-license anything, but that wasn't actually the initial intent of the company. The company initially, following the perceived success of TVEC, or us as prior management, felt we were in a position to raise substantial funds based on that prior success. And the intent was to bring in a number of different oncolytic and related technologies from either other early companies or academia to really try and develop the best and the best, or best of the best, in a more well-funded sort of umbrella than they might have otherwise have been able to achieve before. They might have been sort of stagnating due to a lack of funds and management. So the initial plan was to bring in a couple, two or three different technologies, the best possible technology we could find from either academia or early companies, and develop those under a well-funded umbrella. However, I spent about 2 years really assessing lots of different technologies, and in the end decided actually we could do it better and certainly more simply, and also without giving away IP and equity, etc., and without the complexities of university IP to deal with. It was a lot more simple to just start from scratch ourselves and build on everything we'd learned before, both in developing TVEC and in the field more generally. So the ultimate decision I took was to just actually start from scratch and develop what came out of my head, rather than what had already come out of other people's heads and got to some level of development. So that's really the story of how that came to pass. We felt there ultimately were actually no advantage in bringing the other stuff. It was simpler and easier, and possibly could develop better products by starting from scratch.
Yeah, no, I'm going to say something very similar. In my view, if you have a truly unique idea, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's really the quality of the platform and the molecules that matter, not where they come from. The other point is that even if an idea or a platform comes from academia, there's almost always important work that gets done by the biotech company to refine and adapt the idea before becoming a real drug. The formation of Normunity was built around the notion that we take 30-year biotech veterans or pharma veterans, drug development in industry veterans, next to Li-Ping Chen from Yale, and leverage the advantages of academics and the understanding of folks who've been making drugs in the pharma space for a long time, and try to find synergies. But at the end of the day, a great idea that answers an important medical need, especially with courage and humility, as we talked about before, will make it. Doesn't matter where it comes from.
Thanks, Rachel.
Agreed.
In both situations, the IP, having the control on the intellectual property seems to be important. And, I want to hear both of your thoughts on how do you navigate filing the IP early on? When do you know you have something novel and you need to file an IP, and how does it differ if if you're developing a product on your own versus if you're licensing it from an institution? How do you navigate this IP situation, and what resources have you used in the past? For someone in academia, uh, what resources can they use, or external companies, or any ideas on those?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Well,
Oh,
sure.
well, Rob, by all means,
No
all good.
We can edit that bit out.
Yeah, that's all good.
What I was going to say, yeah. So I obviously Biovex started in the UK at UCL, and the situation, one, 20 years ago, and two, in the UK as compared to the US, may be rather different. But when I was at UCL in the 1990s, they certainly had a very helpful technology transfer office. At that time, a number of biotech companies had span out of UCL and had a degree of success, so they were very enthusiastic to repeat that and do more. So the UCL Tech Transfer Officer was extremely helpful in enabling us to file patents, pay for those patent filings and for the prosecution of that IP for the first few years, and also introduce us to other relevant professionals, lawyers and others who could help us potentially actually legally found a company and bring that IP into Biovex. So they were particularly helpful. However, it is absolutely the case if the academic wasn't of that mindset and of that bent to really wish to and be driving the foundation of the company, then it wouldn't happen. It's not driven by the technology transfer office. It's driven by the actual academic stroke entrepreneur who's really making it happen. And it's that entrepreneur who is actually juggling all the balls and making all those balls come together, even if the technology transfer office is being helpful in sort of lubricating everything and bringing it together. But unless you have the drive of the person who is founding the company to really make it happen, it's just not going to happen. It's going to get stagnated and get bogged down in, if you're not careful, university bureaucracy and inefficiency. So luckily UCL were happy to have a clean relationship with the founded company, which was that they took 30% of the equity in the company when it was founded for assigning all of the IP and materials into the company. And after that, they had no further downstream interest in the company other than initially having a board seat.
Really
And
glad.
that may well be very different to the US situation, and certainly as I know in a lot of cases.
Well, I think every institution has different rules, and it's easier or harder to pull intellectual property out of different institutions. It sounds like you had a very supportive organization, and there are lots of institutions in the United States that have supportive organizations also, but there may be differences between those organizations. So anyone who's going out and looking at the transfer office shouldn't be surprised and should definitely read the fine print. But what I would say is I'm really glad that we're raising IP even so early in this dialogue, to be honest, because a lot of very smart people who are watching this recording need to appreciate that their ideas have to be protected. And the value of the company is very much centered on what the company has access to and freedom to operate with. And also, the asset is defined in part on what you own and what you don't. Most biotech companies that I know in my lifetime actually hire expert IP group. That doesn't mean full-time. It just means getting access to an IP lawyer. It's the first thing I did when I started founding Normunity, was to identify an IP group who could help me understand what I needed to do to ensure and protect. And one of the other things I learned in the years I was in large pharma as well as in biotech is that you'd be amazed at what great ideas need to be protected. And routinely reaching out to an IP lawyer to say, do I have what I need to succeed here is a reflex action that should be taken often. It's important for people in the company to be involved in this process. But it's valuable. It's valuable to have outside experts drive the IP process. Remember, potential investors will extensively kick the tires on intellectual property, and they require that the IP strategy be thoughtful, concrete, and solid for any company that they invest in.
I would echo it's very important to have our patent agents, stroke attorneys who know what they're doing and know enough about your technology to really provide good guidance. So actually, back in those UCL days, we were introduced to the called patent agents in the UK, who drove or did those aspects for us closely with me. I had to work very, very closely with them because they obviously didn't understand the technology, etc. Although over the years became much more versed in it. And in actual fact, at Replimune, we've continued to use those very same company as we did back in the 1990s at Biovex, and they obviously therefore are steeped in decades of this particular technology and now can nearly do it on autopilot. But that has been a great benefit to us. I would say some other things about patents as well. They're obviously very critical. If anything, having freedom to operate is more important in actual fact than having patents on your own things. You obviously do need to have patents on your own things to prevent people going out and directly copying them, although particularly in the biologic space, it's not, and gene therapy and related spaces, it's not always easy to just go out and copy. So actually know-how can be potentially sufficient. But my view is certainly if you're going to found a company, you need some IP. You need to have freedom to operate, but you also don't need too much IP. You need sort of just enough, just the right amount of patent protection. Patents are extremely expensive to prosecute, yes. And having patents purely for the sake of it doesn't actually achieve anything. The reality is for any product, what you need is one claim in one patent which prevents somebody else going out and copying it. Any more than that, you could say is excessive. And having more than that can be extremely expensive for a small company to continue to prosecute. So you need a right balance between having patents which do protect what you do and stop other people doing it, but not keeping patents going just for the sake of it to say you've got lots of patents. Having lots of patents actually often can suggest a lack of discipline in trimming things when they're not actually going anywhere. So you need freedom to operate and you need the right amount of protection. You need the right advisors, there's no doubt, people who actually do understand your technology and therefore can craft your claims and your rest of your patent with understanding. But you yourself are going to need to work very closely with your patent advisors to optimize the IP strategy because they cannot be the experts in your technology in the same way that you obviously are.
That's fantastic advice. It's just worth emphasizing a handful of things. That's why a good patent strategy is important, so that it's not, so that it balances wisdom and cost, but also recognize that understanding the patents of others is an exercise we got into very early to help us understand what other people were doing in the space, to help us define differentiation, and to reinforce the importance of that what we were doing was achieving was filling in a real unmet medical need. So obtaining IP, defining an IP strategy, but also recognizing that understanding other people's intellectual property is as much a part of your strategy as anything else is a vital piece. So really great to have that dialogue.
I completely agree. Whenever you're going into any due diligence, be it for a funding round, for an IPO, for a licensing deal, for an acquisition, whatever it might be, the other party is going to want to get into detailed freedom to operate due diligence. In reality, you as the company should be able to tell them exactly what they should be looking at. And why the things they look at, find, hopefully are not things which should worry them. What you don't want is for them to go out and find things which you don't know about. You need to know about everything before they do. As I said, most optimally, you should be telling them about them. So you show that you recognise what the true reality is, and not pretending it's something else or moving along in blinkers. So you need to know everything. Again, you need to be the expert, not only in your own technology, but in what everybody else is doing around, which could impact your freedom to operate.
Yep. No, that's great. I mean, now we have a patent. The next thing is you're running a business, right? At the end of the day, it's a business. And it's tricky for founders to create a business plan. When do you envision, or how soon in the formation of the company do you have to create a business plan? And what are the key components of that business plan? Your goals, your milestones, and how do you formulate that business plan? Or to ask, how important is to have a clear business plan in the earlier phases of the formation of the company?
Yep, I'm happy to grab that one. I'll touch on three things for a biotech business plan, focusing on strategic aspects, not financial, because that's a separate issue altogether, although I'll touch on it briefly. For a young biotech, the number one most important aspect of the business plan is how you're going to drive a path to get your first drug molecule into the clinic. A very close follow-up element of your plan is to clearly define how your molecule will address an unmet need in a disease, something I've been repeating a bunch of times. It's vital. And how it's, as we talked about before, Rob and I, how competitively it's positioned to win in the market. And third, you have to emphasize ways to de-risk the program. We're currently in an environment where investors are favoring approaches that reduce risk. So it's important to find ways that your concept is connected, if possible, to a biological precedent, proven modalities, or accelerated ways that with early experiments that can de-risk your approach. I'm not saying that novelty is not vital, and I'm not at all saying that complete out-of-the-box thinking, which is obviously how Rob, has run his remarkable career, isn't vitally important. But we're in a very difficult place right now, and paying attention to the nature of the risk, paying attention to the sorts of things that can help reassure your investors that you're likely to succeed is going to be important. One of the earliest people I reached out to in all of the times I was building novel things, either inside a company or building a fresh company from the scratch, is somebody who understands the market from a commercial perspective. It's often underappreciated how vital it is to understand how your customers, patients, doctors, investors, physicians are going to utilize your idea and turn it into, a vital piece of new medicine. And that requires scientific advice, scientific understanding, but also a healthy understanding of the market. I'll stop there.
So I think I'll come at that question at a slightly sort of higher 1,000-foot sort of level. I think at the very beginning, you can't found a company without an, in inverted commas, business plan of at least some sort. And I think the key thing is very clearly defining both yourself and for those who ultimately get to fund it, what the problem you are actually addressing is, in simple terms, and how you're going to address that problem, how your technology will enable a problem which was previously unable to be either at all or fully addressed, is going to be able to be addressed by whatever your technology is, i.e. you show there really is a need for what you're doing and how you're going to do it. And if you can then lay out reasonable stepping stones of a path from where you are now to getting through to an actual approved product, solving whatever that problem might be, then that's an extremely good start. But if you can't fill in any of those boxes, i.e. what the problem is clearly, how your technology is going to address the problem clearly, and the steps on the way to getting from wherever you are to the end result, then you're going to have problems convincing anybody else, including investors, physicians, or anybody else, to believe in it also and provide the funds to do so. So I would put it in those high-level sort of simple terms.
Agreed.
Thank you. Raising money is a big part of building a biotech company. How did you approach fundraising, and how do you think the landscape has changed over the years? Also, how do you figure out how much money do you need to hit a certain milestone, right? Then the follow-up question for that, when you're pitching to VCs for the fundraising, what do you focus on presenting them, and how do you approach these conversations, and how much data you really need before you go on and present to the VCs?
Can I refer you to my previous answer in relation to your latter part of your question? That you have to show the things which I've just said to enable VCs to, or anybody else, to sort of take the bait and want to potentially look into it more deeply and potentially invest.
When do you think data is ready for this, right? Do you want to show proof of concept of a molecule data or animal studies, or when do you think the data is ready, and how soon, once the data is ready, you approach the investors?
Every situation is different. You need to have compelling answers to ticking each of the boxes I mentioned. And every situation really is different. You can go to investors with purely an idea, but with a well thought out logical path as to why with that idea you can get to solving a problem and through to an actual product. Or in other cases, you may need, it can be anything from preclinical data to human data to already being in a pivotal clinical trial. Every single situation is very different, and also obviously everything very much depends on sort of fashion, the whims of what's in fashion and in vogue at the moment. That which may be fundable one year, that even the next year or in 6 months' time may completely be unfundable, and vice versa. And obviously, we're in a particularly strange and challenging and uncertain time at the moment, where nobody really knows where we stand in regard to anything at the moment. I certainly wouldn't at this very moment be wanting to start an early stage biotech company based purely on an unfashionable idea, which is what we were really doing when we started what was then called Neurovex, because gene therapy was very unfashionable in those days. So times are certainly uncertain.
So adding to all those things, which I agree with entirely, for the most important thing to note is that raising money is very difficult, even with a fabulous idea. So buckle up. That's number one. Number two, I think because this particular environment is one where investors are more risk averse, understanding who you're talking to, how they tend to invest, what are they looking for? Knowing your audience is extremely important. And that means at every meeting when you meet with a new investor, every investment firm has a different thesis. Understanding whether they're early investors, late investors, private investors, public investors. There's a lot that you need to understand. So I think it's important that this is where network really matters. You need to have access to potential board members, or if you're lucky enough to have some board members already, advisors, a financial person that's either part of your company full-time or part-time, or someone who can help you manage the process, including developing a strong pitch deck, which I'll say more about in a moment, diligence material, because they need stuff to study, coordinating the investment meetings. Be prepared for this to take months and months and months. In terms of when it's time to start pitching, again, the more you understand the nature of the investors that you're going after. In fact, it's not even a bad idea to pick a handful of investor folks and say to them, this is what I have. What would you need in order for me to come back? In my most recent fundraising, we had iterative dialogues with investors, routinely updating new data as it came in, listening carefully to what they care about. It's a dialogue, one that can be quite nuanced, and is best done with people around you who've done it before, and can be helpful. If you're super lucky, you know folks who can introduce you to investors and help you navigate that process. But most important, just be ready for a lot of rejections and a lot of open dialogues that will get you to where you need to go if you persist.
I'd also go back to saying what's needed before you approach investors, and every situation being different. In some cases, a sort of killer experiment to really show that your hypothesis can really pan out and actually work to be a product could be done on the bench in the lab as an experiment. In other cases, a killer experiment can be done, or a reasonably killer experiment can be done in animals, which really says, wow, if this does this in mice or some other animal, really it's got a good chance of also doing the same in humans. But in other cases, you're only going to be able to do the killer experiment actually in humans. And in still further cases, the killer experiment can only be a randomized controlled phase 3 trial. So, every situation, depending on what you're doing, is different. And therefore, you have to think about how you're best going to convince investors, bearing in mind which of those different phenotypes of program you're developing. I personally would prefer to be involved in programs where you can do killer experiments early and therefore not proceed further if those killer experiments don't come out as you would hope, and not have to proceed all the way to a randomized controlled phase 3 trial before you know.
And
Yeah.
just to put a finer point on this, because I think it's really helpful, every company has a claim, right? Every idea has a sentence. I am bringing to you the following idea. I believe it will work because. The interaction with a potential investor will always be stronger when the because is because I've shown you that it will work. A hypothesis based upon historical data in some other place is one way to defend it, but that's weaker than animal experiments where it's clearly working. That's weaker than human experiments where it's clearly working. At each stage along the way, you make a case, and with each new data point, you build on that case more formally. I don't want to discourage anybody for going into those dialogues early, but recognize that you may need more data before it's going to work.
Yeah, thank you. I think we touched upon this previously. Having a solid idea and a strong team at the inception is critical for success. So building a strong team and board of directors is key to any startup. What advice do you have for recruiting the right people for both? And when do you put your board together? And what are some of the key qualities you looked for?
I mean, to some extent, when you start, your board will be sort of put together for you, because it will be largely comprised of whoever the founders of the company are and the incoming investors, who will each wish to put directors on your board. But you would be well advised to balance that by also bringing in others who from your network, as Rachel says, people you trust and admire and whose judgment you believe will be valuable in helping you and the other directors of the company, who I said may often be investor directors from the VCs have invested, to help bring them all together and have the value of their sage judgment. So you need to balance it. So a network's important, to bring in people you can trust and you can work with, who you respect and whose advice and opinions you will value, which will be a balance to the investor directors, who will be sort of imposed upon you in as much as you may not get to choose who your investors are. Frequently you only have one game in town, and those are the investors you get, and they'll put whoever they want on the board. So you need to try and balance that.
Yep. And to add to that, I think it's so vital that the people you bring into your organization and the people who are supporting you from your investor syndicate, these are fundamental to the success of the company, which is why the very earliest question in this hour was, how did you get to where you are? And I said that for people now that are eager to build their own company or to start from scratch, I really value the years that I spent in large pharma and biotech, because during those years, I accumulated not just knowledge and pattern recognition, watched wild successes and unfortunate failures, all of which accrue in my bag of tricks that I carry on my back. But I also met a lot of people in all walks, and I can tell you that the Normunity now, which is 16 full-time equivalents and dozens more from my network who are working in a fractional manner, all in one way or another have worked for me before or worked for someone who worked for me before. That, that's not the only way to do it. Absolutely not. But it certainly makes it easier when you start out with working relationships. And even a lot of the investors are folks that I've known from before. Just an example from Normunity specifically. I'm building Normunity with my first boss in industry. Tim Shannon was my first boss at Bayer in 1997. And we've remained friends. We've been on projects together. We sat on boards together. I was the chief medical officer of a company where he was on the board. And then 4 years ago, he said, come on, let's do this. And the scientific founder, Lieping Chen, is somebody that I met in the years that I was building the IO organization at Bristol Myers Squibb. So while you can go in fresh with a bold idea, courage, and humility, it can really be helpful when you spend some time understanding the space and gathering relationships and experiences. I find that to be a nice recipe for success.
Rachel, while you're here with me, I think I'd like to hear about how you shaped your company's narrative over the years when you faced challenges, especially with the IO headwinds. How did you decide when to shift gears? And Rob, how have you handled similar situations, shifts at Replimune, and what advice do you offer for managing these pivots?
Rachel can go first.
Yep. Yeah. No, so Normunity has had actually a bunch of pivots. And we're in a really good place right now. So I'm pleased to report about it. So when the company was first founded, the idea was to build simple biological therapeutics against Lieping's targets. Lieping Chen, for those of you who don't know, identified PD-L1, a key target in immuno-oncology. He is, in fact, an engine of targets. And so the simple idea was to identify a class of targets that cause immunosuppression in tumors and then build antibodies to inhibit them. But as I've been saying over the course of the last hour, the market now is a very tricky one. And with the headwinds in IO, completely novel targets with completely novel mechanisms of action, with completely novel assumptions about the translation from animal models to people is a tough sell. I really do believe that Lieping is onto something very important, and we have a pipeline filled with biologics that are doing what we had hoped they would do. But about 2 years ago, I began to wonder whether I was going to be able to build a company successfully around those bold ideas. And so with courage and, arguably, I don't know, can a person actually say humility? That's kind of weird. I don't think you can do that. But the bottom line is we took a deep breath and said, what's true about the market right now that we can build a healthy organization around? And so we took Lieping's targets, noting that T-cell engagers and antibody drug conjugates and even radioligands are showing momentum in solid tumors, and began to take our antibodies and put payloads on them. And our first drug, which will be in the clinic by the end of this year, is in fact a T-cell engager against an exquisitely tumor-specific target that no one's ever worked on before because they're novel. We have an ADC program and a radioligand program against these targets that balances the novelty of the target biology with the familiar themes of T-cell engagers, antibody drug conjugates, and radiopharma that the world has come to appreciate drive real value. And in so doing, by turning away from the initial plan and moving towards something, I think, a bit more sophisticated, a bit bolder, but arguably a bit safer, we just closed a meaningfully oversubscribed Series B. And we're moving forward with plenty of cash to take us well beyond proof of concept.
So I think I'll talk about your question from the perspective of BioVex rather than Replimune. I think from the beginning of BioVex to the end of BioVex, when it was really acquired by Amgen, we always had the courage of our convictions in as much as we believe that the technology worked and it was actually delivering at each stage what one would hope it would deliver to take you to the next stage, other than the change, sort of reorganization of the company, reconfiguration a couple of years in when we changed from being Neurovex to BioVex and essentially abandoned neurogene therapy due to having decided it was too hard for us. And the reality is no one's got to the finish line even now, 20 years later, or more than 20 years later. But on the oncolytic virus front, we always did have the courage of our convictions, although we were often existing in a place where nobody else did. We were doing lots of things, or things which were defined in very unfashionable ways. It was an immunotherapy, it was a gene therapy, it was a cancer vaccine, all of which much of the time were very unfashionable words or areas to be in. So in a way, how we navigated that, while still, as I said, at each stage seeing data which we felt showed that it actually did work and was worth taking to the next stage, was actually redefining what we called it. We just made a point of trying not to use any of those words which were red flags to investors and others, and over time just calling it different things to align with what was the least unfashionable at that time. I would say 90% of the time, anything which called itself gene therapy was extremely unfashionable. It then went into fashion and now sort of semi back out of fashion. So we avoided using red flag words which would just switch investors off immediately and say, go away, we're not interested in anything which is a cancer vaccine or a gene therapy. So how we framed what we were doing was extremely important to enable us to maintain the courage of our convictions and take our products to the next stage without over-inflaming investors into thinking we were doing things which were just not in their areas of interest. And that's a sort of simple answer to your question, but you need to follow fashion and present your arguments in a way which aligns with what investors actually want to invest in a particular time, and in particular isn't in an area that they just have an allergic reaction to at that time.
Thank you, Rachel. Anything to add? If not, I'm going to close the session. I have a closing statement.
No, it's great. Go right ahead. What fun this was.
Thank you both for your time and all the insights. At their core, both the panelists are driven by a mission to push immunotherapy forward, leveraging academic research, biotech innovation, and strategic partnerships to bring transformative treatments to patients. Thank you for attending today's program, and thanks to all the speakers for their excellent insights. Thanks again. We look forward to seeing you all at the next session. Thanks.